that was what was supposed to happen to these apes.
What happened?
Well, I'll tell you. A new lab had been constructed for Atlanta. She'd been moved out of a small little 8 by 10 room in the Yerkes, heart of the Yerkes Center, into a metal building in back of the Yerkes Center. And 4 new chimpanzees had been added to the project as Duane got a new grant from NICHD. So the big scientific question of the time was, well, so Lana learned something, and Washoe learned something, and Sarah learned something. Are these just unusual chimps, kind of one of a kind? Can you teach others? So that's why Roger started with 4 young chimps, and then Premack started with 4 young chimps, and then Duane started with 4 young chimps. So there were 4 young chimps in each of those projects with different methodology, all of which had gotten funding. And each of the investigators, understandably, didn't really quite know how they got what they got. David Premack certainly didn't know how he got what he got. He didn't even get what he thought he got. The Gardners didn't know exactly how Washoe came to do all the 120 signs, but they knew it was a lot different than Vicky, who had only learned a few signs, or Gua, who had only learned a few signs. So they wanted to start with 4 younger chimps and see how many signs they could learn. And Duane was getting language and dialogue and stock sentences and grammar. And he had thought about how to get all of this when he put it together, but then it all came so fast, he didn't really understand that he had actually put the right things together and that he even needed all of these things. So he started with 4 young chimps, and they were to learn single words. They weren't even to learn stock sentences, and they didn't even have dispensers. So all of the things that they had put in place for Lana to make sure that Lana paid attention, that she saw the lexicograms, that she had grammatical categories, that they were coded in different colors, that they moved out in a tree-like branch, so you had to learn at every point you branched off from one kind of symbol to another, like from a verb to an object. You had choices to make, and it wasn't just see something and make a sign, or see something and shoot. You had to make this choice, and when you made this choice, different things happened, and it all went different ways. So she had, your classic diagram. She had to learn language that way. They didn't understand all of the things that had worked, and they particularly didn't understand the role of dialogue between Tim and Lana. We didn't really have dialogue with Washoe in the same way, or with Lucy. What we had was going around the house or outside and saying, "What's this? What's that? What do you do with this? What do you do with that?" So we asked them questions all the time. And then if we wanted to play, they had to sign tickle. If they wanted to chase, they had to sign chase. So we had routines. We didn't have stock sentences. We had stock routines that we went through. And they could make small changes in those routines easily. Like if Washoe learned the sign meet, she could easily transfer it to a new meet. If she learned the sign open, she could easily transfer it to something that nobody had ever shown her the sign open for. So there was generalization, and the Gardners felt that meant it was language if there was generalization. But it was generalization of how you get done what you want done when. It wasn't like we sit down and talk about things. And there wasn't a dialogue. It was mostly questions and answers and signs and what do you want? I want this, we'll do that. So there was exchange, but it wasn't dialogue in the sense that Tim and Lana had dialogue. Lana wouldn't have learned anything except through dialogue. That's the only way she had to learn. So she would say something like, "Please, Tim, move into room," which might be a stock sentence. And then Tim would say, "No, move into room." Then what would she do? Then she'd say, "Well, please, Tim, move out of room." And then he would say, Tim's out of the room. And he didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to do. But they had to have a dialogue. So they kept having all these dialogues. And out of these dialogues came an understanding of the intentions. The intentions were already being portrayed by the nonverbal postures, the tone of voice, the gestures, the glances, the exchanges. Just like I was learning with Bowie how to tickle and play and chase, Tim and Lana were learning about how to move around the room, how to move in and out of the room, how to get food in the dispenser, how to get food out of the dispenser. They were learning how to do all of this through a dialogue that had to be structured through a Yerkes grammatical system. There was no other way. The computer wouldn't allow it. So that kind of phenomena didn't happen with Premack. It didn't happen with Washoe. Dwayne and Tim didn't understand exactly what was happening, except they knew that Lana was doing all these amazing new things and was even asking, like, question what name of this. She started asking for names, and then she just started using the names that, so I could see that Lana got all of these things that Washoe didn't get and that I didn't see Lucy get, although Lucy was much smarter than Lana. So I was trying to figure all that out as a psychologist when Dwayne was trying to expand the project to 4 young apes, and the 4 young apes weren't learning anything. And it went on month after month after month after month, and Lana had learned so quickly, and they weren't learning anything. And so Dwayne didn't know what to do, and Tim didn't know what to do. And I said to him, well, I just don't understand why they're not learning anything. I worked with Bowie and Bruno and Cindy and Thelma and Lucy and Allie, and even though I didn't feel it was like real language, they could learn something. You could hold up something and you could put it in front of them and make a sign, and they could learn to make the sign. Exactly what they meant by the sign and whether it was language, I didn't really know. It wasn't the same thing Pancho was doing with me, but maybe it would become language. And I didn't work that much with Washoe because Roger mostly focused on her, and I felt she knew 100 signs, and maybe it was going to a different place with 100 signs, So I said to Dwayne, it can't be that you teach them over and over for a year and they don't learn anything. That's just not going to happen. Something is really wrong. I don't know what's really wrong, but something's really wrong. So he said, well, because you've worked with these other chimps in the signing project, why don't you go spend some time in the lab and try to figure out what's possible to do or where the problem is. So I went down and started spending time with those chimps trying to figure out what the problem was. And it was very clear that they weren't learning, and they had had hundreds of thousands of trials. And he had set it up where an object was shown, and like a box or a bowl or a cup, and you showed them the object, and they would either tell you what color it was or they would give it a name, which the name was called, it was a shape-form discrimination. So either you pay attention to the form or you pay attention to the color. And I had done a lot of work on children's attention skills. Some young children pay attention to form and others pay attention to color. And if you're trying to use language and they're paying attention to color and you're teaching them form names, they do get confused, and vice versa. So Dwayne thought maybe this is what was happening. We didn't know what was happening, but they weren't learning either color or form. Not only were they not learning either color or form, they were doing things like lying on their back and punching the keys with their toes, things that Lana had never done. But Lana had this bar that she had to pull down, and it positioned her in front of the keyboard, and when she hung on it, the keyboard turned on. And when she hit a key, it came up big on the projectors. Well, they didn't think there needed to be any difference between the chimps' projectors and the teachers, which were Tim's projectors. But in the original one, Dwayne had worried about that. So he had Tim's utterances and Lana's utterances. So Lana, as soon as she turned her keyboard on and started touching things, if Tim was saying anything, she knew it wasn't her. She knew it was Tim. She could see Tim out there, and Tim's utterances appeared there. They didn't think that's important. What's important for dialogue? And you're having a silent system, and you got to know who's talking. Who's talking when they're punching these buttons? This is talking, and this is me, and this is you, and I'm watching it, and we have these strings that have to be in this order. So Lana's whole system, hundreds of thousands of hours and dollars went into putting in that specific system to put everything to make dialogue work, structured sentences work, put Lana's attention on it by where she had to hold the bar. If she let that bar go, she couldn't see it. So I go down there, and Duane is not really there. He's the chairman of psychology, so you tell him what's going on, and he comes for a few moments, and then you go talk to him. And I'm like, these chimps are lying on the back, and they're hitting the keys with their toes, and they don't know that they're their projectors, and they don't know what's Tim's projector, and they don't have any dispensers. And why did you change everything? I don't even know what it did, but you've changed it all. And now I'm supposed to figure out what the problem is. There's the problems everywhere. So Duane had somebody else named Susan Essick from Brown University watching over these studies and designing these studies. And so she designed this color form study, and it got approved by the granting agency. And she was really in charge, but she was finishing her PhD, so she couldn't really come and figure out what was wrong because she had to do her PhD. And it was a very well-planned study, but had no insight into ape behavior. Zero. None. And Tim didn't know why things weren't working, and Duane didn't know why things weren't working. So Duane said, you need to stop with the bonobos, and you need to help down there figure out why things are not working. So I started really reading Duane's publications in great detail and trying to figure out how Lana did everything that she did, and did she really understand what she was doing, because I wasn't sure that Lana actually knew what she was even doing or why any of it happened, because I hadn't been there when it happened. But I knew Lana was doing something Washoe was not doing, not by any stretch of the imagination, and that by working with a written language that stayed up, something was really different than working with these signs, which as soon as they made them, they were gone. You couldn't point to the chimp that this is the sign you made. It was gone. But you could say to Lana, you said this, and this is the answer. And that was just a huge, huge thing, because you had her behavior right there, or Sherman or Austin's behavior right there, and you could look at it and you could say, you said apple. This is not an apple, But you sign apple, and it's gone. So this is a big difference between a written language and a transitory language. So I decided that since I didn't really know why Lana has succeeded, that I would ask them to put back as many of the aspects of Lana's training as I could, and I would try to start over with what Lana had done. But the one aspect I was very hesitant to put back was the stock sentence. And the reason was that as I came in, Lana's stock sentences had increased from 5 words, so she could possibly make 9 words in her sentence. And they each had to go through that grammatical structure. And by the time I came, this change had happened all at once in Lana's life, from 5, which she'd learned each of those 5 very carefully, to 9, boom. And they didn't think she needed dispensers anymore, so Lana didn't have any dispensers. And she was having to make these really complex sentences with in and behind and under and words that were not point-attable. And they had to occur at the right place in her sentence. And when I watched Tim and Lana, I just felt Lana had gotten totally confused, and there was no way to tell her what was wrong, because it could have been any of those 9 words, and it could have been in the location of any word among those 9 words. So how many possibilities is that for a single error? You made an error. Well, what was the error? Well, and then you make another error. You can make, for one word, you can make, I don't know, hundreds of errors, and you don't know what the error was. So I was scared to do the stock sentence thing, and they had already focused on single words. So I focused on putting single foods in a dispenser and getting them to hit a key, and that dispenser would turn and a single food would drop out. And they did that with one dispenser in a day. So then I tried to put, an apple in, because they'd learned apple, and then orange, and then banana. Well, they didn't look at the different foods. They just hit apple, and that dispenser was supposed to give them an apple, and then whatever it gave them, they would eat. I'm like, oh, this isn't working. Lana had 4 dispensers, so I went back to Dwayne and I said, we need at least 4 dispensers for every cage, and we need at least 2 drink dispensers, if not more. We have to have a separate dispenser for every single food and every single drink, just like you had for Lana. Well, when you fund that for 1 chimp, it doesn't cost them. When you fund that for 4 chimps, and they're squished in these little rooms, and you want dispensers everywhere, and they're doing all these things, and the computer is operating all of them, and it's a PDP-8, they go, 4 dispensers for each chimp. So we had to shift the chimps in the rooms, and we set up 2 rooms with a number of dispensers. And what I found was within 2 weeks, maybe within a week, if you always put the apples here, you always put the bananas there, you always put the oranges here, and you always put the M&Ms here, then they learned that immediately. Position-based learning, nothing. In a few trials. Oh, I hit this when there's an apple in the apple dispenser. I hit this when there's an M&M in the dispenser. And if you change them all around, it's kind of a problem, but not really much. It's like, oh, you got the M&Ms down here. You know, so M&Ms got disambiguated from the position and the dispenser by moving it around and keeping the others empty. Oh, M&M's here. Oh, M&M's here. Oh, M&M's here. Oh, oh, M&M's. Oh, that's just M&M's. Well, I don't care where you have it. I want the M&M's. So through that spatial thing, in a couple of weeks, they knew every food. And it had been a year, and they hadn't learned these things. So then I just put the foods, you know, like an M&M, and then a banana, and then an apple. And at first they just started hitting the key over, and then I said, no, look. Look, I need attention, you know. And, oh, that's an M&M. And they look through, you know, and then pretty soon, that was really quick too, within a week, you could put any food in the dispenser, and they knew exactly what it was, and they could operate the dispenser, so they knew the exact symbol, and then you could move that symbol easily anywhere on the keyboard, and they could track it. So soon we had as many as 10 food symbols. They could be located anywhere on the board. They could be located anywhere in the lab, and they knew how to use that symbol to ask for that food if you showed them that food. By that time, we were getting to where Bowie and Bruno were. You hold up a banana, they can sign a banana. You hold up orange, and they can sign orange, you know, which taught me a lot about orienting the attention. It's all about how you're orienting the attention of the ape. If you want it to learn how you're treating these events. So I'm treating this event of touching a symbol as something that makes me give you a food either through my hands or through the dispenser. If we have our joint attention on that food, and then you put your attention on that symbol, and then I see that symbol, then I can give you that food. And when you're not getting the learning, you haven't gotten the joint attention. And if you don't have skills at joint attention, you're really not going to learn language or anything else. So we focused a lot on joint attention.
So can you just say joint attention is what?
Joint attention is like when I look over there and I look back at you. I'm seeing if you're paying attention to what I'm paying attention to. And this comes in with mothers and infants about 3 months, well in by 6 months, unless you have a mother that's a bit distracted, and it can be delayed up to 1.5 years. And if you have it delayed, you'll get language delay. It's a big topic in the study of language, and Mike Tomasello's done a lot of work in it after this work, but we're putting our attention on the same thing, and then we're referring, we're making a gesture, a glance, an utterance. We're putting our attention on that Diet Pepsi. We're making an utterance about that Diet Pepsi. I'm acting on that Diet Pepsi. You're acting on that Diet Pepsi. We know we're both doing it together in our minds because we can move our eyes in a coordinated way that say, I'm looking at what you're looking at. Austin and Sherman were born at Yerkes.
Okay.
And like most apes born at Yerkes, they were taken from their mother and put in a nursery. Sherman was left with his mother named Cookie for about 1.5 years, so he was more normal than Austin. Austin's mother was one of the original Reeson and Neeson chimps that were raised in cubicles with nobody touching them. People changed their diapers with through handholds. So they had no eye contact, no comfort, no one holding them. And at that point, people had no idea what that would do to a chimp. They did that study to find out. And all of those chimps were severely disturbed and could not really become normal. Austin's mother became normal enough that she had some kind of sex and had Austin, but she didn't know how to take care of Austin. So that's the story. So they took Austin at birth. Sherman's mother, Cookie, was wild caught, and she knew how to take care of Sherman. So they left Sherman with her till he was 1.5 years, and then he was placed in the language study where he was in the Yerkes nursery, where chimps are kept in small cages. He might have had one other chimp, but a lot of times they're alone. And they just stay there in those cages all day. So Sherman had that experience from 1.5 years. Austin had it from birth. So Austin was much more disturbed than Sherman, and we had to do a lot more work. We also had Erica, who was raised in a human home with children and was then donated to the Yerkes nursery at about 1.5 years of age. And we had Kenton, who was probably placed in the nursery around 6 months of age. So we had those 4, and they were not wild caught. The bonobos were wild caught. Chimps and bonobos never are wild caught at more than 1 year to 6 months of age. The mother is shot and the baby's taken. So every captive ape that you will meet or you will know, they came, or their mother came, at 6 months or 1 year of age. And they were not raised in a group, even if they came from the wild. But if they were 1 or 1.5, like Cookie, they have much more normal behavior than if they come at 1 month or 2 months.
I see.
So because Austin was taken probably within a few days because his mother wasn't nursing, he did this all the time. He just constantly rocked.
Like an autistic child.
So we had to carry him everywhere and show him all kinds of things and work really hard to get eye contact at all with him. With Sherman, we could get eye contact, but it was fleeting, and it wasn't joint regard. So we had to work to do that. Sally Boyson often said, you know, these are the chimps that came out of the box. We had to get them out of the box and do rehabilitation as you would with an autistic child to get them to do anything with the keyboard, which is one of the reasons they were behind Lana. They had problems. Lana pretty much came directly from Cookie, didn't stay very long in the Yerkes nursery, into the actual language box, which was much bigger and had movies and sound and lexicograms and interaction at least part of the day with Tim Gill. So she had some socialization. The gardeners felt that that shouldn't even be called socialization, and they were so angry that Duane called that socialization and called that dialogue, that when Duane asked them to write the foreword for his book on Lana chimpanzee, they met us in the hotel room and they threw the book at Duane. Alan Gardner was so angry.
You mean after it was published?
He wanted them to write the foreword, and they
Oh,
refused.
so
And
they
then we were at a common meeting, and he
I see.
invited them to come to the meeting. We had lots of graduate students there. Alan Gardner screamed at Duane and threw the book at him. Duane said, "I wanted to work with you. I asked you to write the foreword." Boom!
That sounds like
He was
a
angry.
chimpanzee throwing
He
around.
was angry. It was like, you have raised this chimp in isolation. You've used conditioning techniques, and we're trying to do this social engagement. We are with Washoe 4 or 5 hours a day. Of course, we put her in a crib with a cage on it at night and lock her up, but we don't tell anybody that because that's where chimps should sleep. Everybody knows that. They don't sleep with you in the bed. So he was very upset. So the situation with the 4 young chimpanzees, they each had slightly different backgrounds. They were different than Lana's background, and they were very different than the bonobo's background. And the bonobo's background is very different from any captive ape. They came when they were just at puberty, just entering puberty, and they came with probably their grandmother. And a grandmother's never been captured, ever, in the wild. And a mother, I've never heard of a mother being captured, but grandmothers aren't even seen, you know. And a grandmother's never been captured. But they were captured under a special dispensation from the National Academy of Sciences to go in and capture these bonobos to determine if they were a different species. So they weren't being brought for a zoo. And the idea was they would go back in 6 months or a year at the most, and there would be a big research station started, funded by the National Academy of Sciences, to study bonobos in their native area. That was what was supposed to happen to these apes. But the background is very different for these bonobos. So when we met Matata, she was about this age. And that's Sally Boyson and the anatomist Adrian Zillman walking with Matata. And Matata is walking what?
On her 2 feet, yeah.
And one of the first things I found was that bonobos walk more on 2 feet. And they walk differently on 2 feet. And I thought it was because they were bonobos. And what did Itai tell you at his seminar?
That in different circumstances, they learn to, they change.
Chimps were walking on 2 feet.
Yeah.
So it's not because they're bonobos.
Right,
It's culture.
Right.
So what happens when you have a baby bonobo, it has, do you know what the Babinski reflex is?
No.
If you have do you know what it is, Laurent? You do? So the Babinski reflex is if you have a baby and it's on let's say a piece of cloth with a cover under it, so it's fairly sturdy, you know, and the baby's just kind of lying there like that, and it's smiling and it's happy. And you just drop that just a little bit, the baby goes like that, up until 6 months, I don't know. And if you are a mother and your hair is hanging down, it's grabbing your hair. This is what a human baby does. And its feet kind of go like that, but its arms go like that. So if you were carrying the baby, let's say you were wading in water waist deep, and you were kind of holding the baby, and the baby's holding on your hair, and you're looking for shells or mussels, and you step in a hole, the baby's going to go like that, and it's going to survive. Well, if you're a chimp and you're up in a tree and your baby's only doing that with its hands, and you're in a tree, and something, you move really fast and the baby does that, it could die. So it needs to do it with its feet. As soon as you make any startle movement, you know, maybe a predator comes and you jump, if that baby isn't immediately on you, it's dead. So every chimp baby, every orang baby, every gorilla baby, every bonobo baby, by a few months has that reflex, and it's very strong with its feet. It's particularly strong in orangs, which are the most arboreal, because the baby's most likely to fall. So if you have an orang baby on you, you almost can't get it off. You like take 2 hands and then you take another one and you get this one and these are back on, and it's just like you have to have somebody help you get the baby off sometimes. It's just, it always will cling with one thing. Gorillas less so, quite a bit less so. And bonobos and chimps about the same. Bonobos a little bit less so. Gorilla feet are a little more like human feet. So when you have a bonobo baby, if you do that, it goes like that with its feet and its hands, and it clings onto you. So because the baby is always clinging on to the mother like that, what the baby is always thinking, where's mom? Is she moving? Do I need to cling on to her? It's feeling it also. Let's say it's just sitting in the lap eating a little wild pomegranate or, you know, bolingo or something, taking a taste, and mom looks like this, the baby's like that instant, you know. But the mom can not be startled, and she can say, "Oh, just cling here. We're going over there," and she can look to see if her baby notices, and the baby's like, "Oh, I'll just cling on to you," and then they can go slowly. But in a startle situation, the baby's always doing that. So a baby who is reared that way in the wild has a very close connection with the mom. One great psychologist, Trevarthen, calls it, the baby feels mommy and I are one. We're not differentiated emotionally, psychologically. And he talks about human mothers and babies having that connection really early.
Mm-hmm.
But then the mother begins to separate that, the human mother, by taking the baby and putting it there. And it's in a little thing, so it sits up. And then the mother gets eye contact. But if the baby's like this, excuse me, you know, it's hard to have eye contact, particularly if you're walking on your knuckles. And if the baby gets so heavy that it can't cling on, then you have to put it on your back, and you can't have eye contact. So what we found with Kanzi and Matata, because Matata was wild reared, she knew all these things. So she was teaching Kanzi how to be a good baby, but because she accepted me as her friend, it was okay for me to carry Kanzi. I told you that Kanzi just jumped on me.
Yeah.
So she's like, okay, you can carry him for a while, and we're both walking together in the forest, and he's heavy. You carry him for a while. So when I would carry him, he would look where he was going to go, and then if he reached out for something, I would say, oh, you want that little cherry on that tree. And he would like reach toward it, and then I would take him. That took maybe 2 days before he pointed. He understood what pointing was. But many psychologists, if you'll look in the literature, there is probably 20 years of literature about whether apes point or not, because they're apes versus humans.
Mm-hmm.
Is pointing inside you? No, pointing is between us. And pointing comes out of reaching. And it's very, very simple. Any mother can figure this out. Male psychologists have a real difficulty with this concept. They think pointing is in here, not in the dialogue. But at that particular point in time, nobody was talking about those things. If you look back at the literature at that time, you won't find these relational discussions about gesture, joint regard, eye contact. It came in the literature after I began to do it and show that Sherman and Austin could do it, and show that Sherman and Austin, as they were eating these different foods, were making eye contact. Should we take this one? Do you see this lexigram? And people didn't know that apes could do that kind of thing. Well, one thing that I didn't mention yesterday when I talked about the chimps at Oklahoma, I gave you lots of examples of interesting things that happened, interesting stories, and I have many, many more. What I didn't tell you is that most of the things I did there were science, and I studied a lot, and I did a lot of very good science there, much of which I haven't talked about, with all of those people that I told you helped me. And because I was very interested in child development, and because I was the oldest of 7 kids, and because I taught all of the 4 younger kids in my family to read before they went to school, and I didn't teach them to talk, but I studied their talking. So I was very interested in the development of child mind. That's what I was going into before I met apes. The origin of mind, the development of child mind. So I watched all of the different kinds of things that these apes from these different backgrounds were able to do in an attention-oriented way. And one of the major driving questions that was always in my mind at the University of Oklahoma, because I had this son who was 2, 3 when I started, and these young apes, and everybody, said, when these young apes grow up, they're going to be housed in these cages where the adult apes are. And you can only go in there once or twice and you can see them, but you won't need to go in there ever again. And you will work out here with these younger apes, and when they get big, they go there. And I just couldn't understand, why would they go there? Why did they have to go there? What was didn't make sense. If they could be out here and doing all these wonderful things and playing and tickling with me, why did they grow up to be, quote, unmanageable? And why were apes always growing up to be unmanageable? And I just thought, Shane is not going to grow up to be unmanageable. Why is Bowie going to grow up to be unmanageable? Why is Bruno going to grow up to be unmanageable? And I couldn't figure that out. And why was Lucy, when I met Lucy, she was already at puberty and she wasn't unmanageable. And Pancho wasn't unmanageable. And I couldn't figure out what was going on in this human creation of how apes became. So when I did my dissertation was a very detailed study, really, of communicative behavior in apes, although it was called an ethogram. And the things I published were about how apes interacted with each other and how behaviors that you do with your mom, you learn them with your mom, and then you're going along in your cage, which is all I could see them in, and you meet another baby that's suddenly going along, and each baby's only done stuff with its mother, and now it's trying to walk, and it sees this other baby. What does it do? Because it's not a mother. So you get this joint behavior with each of them thinking they're doing something like a mother, but it's not a mother, and you get this new behavior that comes out of what they knew. So I had spent, thousands and thousands of hours and videotaped all apes of all different ages and all different rearing backgrounds, looking at that videotape in slow motion. I could play any ape video over in my mind 1,000 times and turn it forwards and backwards. So by the time I got to Sherman and Austin, I had a whole mind full, and I had a whole mind full of what my brothers and sisters did, what the apes did, this question of where is this all going wrong, that they're not growing up, and what role is language playing in growing up to be manageable.
I see. So with Sherman and Austin, what did you do to bring them out of or at least Austin, out of this sort of autistic behavior?
The first thing we did was carry him more, and whenever he rocked, we would pick him up. So he didn't just have that isolation. He did begin to rock less, but at that point we weren't trying to replace the parents, the missing parents. We were just trying to get the 4 apes to get along. So we would leave every day like at 6 or 7 and come in the morning at 8 or 9. And so they were all alone, but they always kind of clung to each other at night.
I see.
So we worked on communication between Sherman and Austin. And because that wasn't going anyplace, we worked on communication with Sherman with me, Austin with me, Sherman with Sally, Austin with Sally, a whole range of different things where we did simple things, tickling and playing, putting objects in boxes, bringing objects to us, going outside, climbing up and down trees when, we have Matata out here climbing up and down trees. Interactive, highly interactive, mobile type things that they had never gotten to do in a nursery. They're in a box. So the body starts to move, and the body starts to move in coordination with others who are talking about, we're going outdoors, 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 outdoors.
Really?
Yeah. So the motion, the coordination, the sound began to draw them out.
And how far did they get with the language work? What did you do with her? Did they start on the lexicograms, or was that later?
They started on the lexicograms from the moment that they were in that project. So I focused their attention first on the dispensers, then on the food in the dispensers, then on what I was doing with the food, then on my intentions with the food, and then on things like the refrigerator where all the food was. And I would say, I'm going to get an M&M, so I'm focusing their attention on the lexigram before I actually get an M&M, and then I go to the refrigerator like, do you really want an M&M? I'm opening the door. Would you like to ask for an M&M? And they go, M&M. And M&M, that's what you wanted me to get out of here. I forgot. I couldn't really see. I see now. So I get that. So I taught the other people in the lab how to do the similar kinds of things. So these symbols began to establish patterns of communication, nonverbal communication between us. And I wanted that to be both ways, not just you see it and you ask for something, but what if I need an M&M? I get hungry. I'm looking at the M&M. Can you see what I'm looking at and pick it up and give it to me? Because language is a two-way street. What good does it do? And that's the kind of thing I had trouble with Lana. She knows all these words, but I don't know how to use them with her. Tim seemed to know how to use them with her, but they had something that I didn't know how to fit myself into. It seemed like it was nonverbal and really working for Lana, but it had been so exclusively Tim and Lana, and so exclusively how they used their symbol system. It's kind of like twin language or something. I didn't know how to interpose myself into it, and Tim didn't have. It was all about what Tim eventually through dialogue could get Lana to achieve. Lana wasn't intentionally trying to get Tim to achieve things, but if she didn't get Tim to at least load the dispenser, she couldn't ask for the food. So she did learn to get Tim to do things. I was reaching for that from the earliest single word phase. If I'm going to give you food, then I ought to be able to invert this paradigm and put all these foods out here, and I can use the keyboard, and you can give me a food, and I'll eat it, and I'll be happy. And that was very difficult. Initially, there was zero comprehension that this paradigm could be inverted and that I could want the food. And your job was not to look through all these symbols, but to look through all these foods that you really wanted to eat and not eat one of them. And then look at what I said. And even though you wanted to eat every one, you couldn't. You had to look and see what I said and pick it up and give it to me, and I was going to eat it. And then we would take turns doing that. And those were Sue's rules. So it took a long time for them to inhibit the behavior of just wanting to eat the food. And then it took another amount of time for them to realize that when I hit a symbol, I was making a statement about something I cared about. My whole role wasn't just to be there to get them to use language. They needed to use language with me. And so I had to do things like go, point at the food like, and they finally like, she really does want to eat that food. And she really is eating the symbol, and they would start to do that.
So figuring out what you wanted as opposed to just what they needed to do in order to get a reward or something like that.
Because when I first taught them how to ask for all the foods, I put them in a room together with foods between them to see if they could use their language with each other. Nobody had ever done that. Roger had tried with Bowie and Bruno to get them to sign tickle or chase with each other, but all they had to do was do a play face and then they start tickling. Then Roger would make them sign tickle. It was redundant. They weren't really communicating the information. So I wanted to see if Sherman and Austin, since they passed all of the Gardner's tests and they could name all of these foods, could they use it with each other, which was a question you couldn't ask with Lana. You couldn't ask it with Washoe. So you have a speaker and a listener in language. Can you use both of these things? If you learn, psychologists at that time thought if a child had a word in the vocabulary, it meant they understood the word as well as produced the word. And they weren't really testing for understanding. So the first people working with apes didn't think they needed to test for understanding. If they could produce it, of course they understood it. So I tested Sherman and Austin for understanding, and they had no joint regard, no understanding, no nothing. They just ate the food. So I worked on getting that receptive competency of language in place, and it meant a lot of understanding of nonverbal signals and a good nonverbal relationship. Once they had this ability to go back and forth and ask each other for foods, we set up a little table with lots of foods on it. 2 pieces of raisin, 2 pieces of M&M, 2 pieces of orange, 2 pieces of apple, and one of them sat right next to the keyboard and the other one sat on the other side. So there was always a listener and a speaker. And the speaker's role was to say, oh, I'd like some water. And the listener's role was to pick up 2 glasses of water and give himself one and the other ape one. And we varied things on the table all the time, and we made some portions bigger and others smaller. So it was a kind of a situation in which they could each sit down and share food, but it differed every time. And as we let them do this, they started adding their own chimpanzee gestures and vocalizations and coordination. It became very high level. I still have not analyzed those tapes to show the high level of nonverbal coordination that went into this food sharing. So, in a sense, if I'm saying water and you're picking up the water and giving it to me, and I've already learned that when you say water, when I say water, somebody gives it to me. Sue gives it to me, but now Sherman is giving it to me. You could say that's conditioned or learned because Sue trained that. But what began to happen in this situation is that sometimes Sherman or Austin, if Austin, he'd be looking around like, oh, what am I going to ask for? What have I asked for now? What is there left on the keyboard? And he and Sherman would kind of look at each other and they'd point like, do you want this one? Oh, I don't know. Do we want that one? They'd point the other one. You know, they're getting this nonverbal agreement through gestures about what their next behavior was. And then sometimes Sherman would like, oh, you're taking too long, Austin. And he would just say, okay, I'm going to give you raisins. So he made a statement about what he was going to do in the future. Then he'd pick up the raisins and give Austin the raisins and give himself the raisins. And nobody ever taught such a behavior, to make a statement about what you're going to eat. Later, a statement about where we're going to go. A statement about what we're going to do. So when I saw that, that's very like what a child does when they really start to grasp language. They start to say they're going to do things. And then you're expected to coordinate with them because they're telling you what they're going to do. Sometimes it can be what they want to do, but it becomes a statement when they're not really asking you your permission. They're giving you the contents of their minds. And they're giving you the contents of their minds because they know that your mind isn't the same. And then the relationship between you two becomes how you negotiate the differential contents of your mind. So when you start to talk about one thing and they start to talk about another, you know, like Sherman's talking about M&Ms and orange, Austin's wanting orange drink, and we only do one at a time. Which are we going to do? And they understood that this was happening, that their contents of the minds were different. And they were making this kind of statement about their future behavior. So when I saw this was happening, I decided to try to design a study that could show others if it were happening. And the only way you could do that is if you look at something that happens the very first time on trial 1. You can't, even if you had one trial and training, people would say, well, they just picked it up really quick. You trained them, but they didn't really understand that. So I designed a study in which I trained them that if I held, by that time I could just do these abstract things. It didn't all have to be about communication because they had, once they get this idea that it's in their mind and what's in your mind is different and I'm actually functioning at a referential level, however long it takes to get there, once you get there, it's all different because you know symbols are symbols and we're using symbols and you're using symbols and you're using them that way and I'm using this way and we need to negotiate how we're using them. But it took a long time to get there with Sherman and Austin. But once we got there, I could then say, okay, this is a this is a that, this is a new symbol. I could even put a new symbol on the keyboard and bring in a new food they'd never used and they'd just hit a new symbol immediately because they knew. And then they would both learn that symbol. Austin would learn it if Sherman used it once and you didn't need any training. So by the time we got to functioning at that level, I decided that I would take 3 foods and 3 tools and teach them that instead of this being a wrench and this being a key and this being some other tool, we're going to call all these tools all these things that we use to get food out of things, we're going to call them all this lexicgram. So whenever I pick one of them up, you tell me it's a tool. And these three foods, bread, bean cake, and orange, whatever, whenever I show you any of these three foods, just tell me it's a food. That's all you have to do. We're only interested in these two lexicograms, and all you have to do is tell me, is this a food or a tool? And I taught them with three foods and three tools, and then I added all the others that I had no training with. Mm-hmm. And the first time I added all the other tools, they said, this is a tool, this is a tool. When every other time, every other thing, if I held it up, they would give me its name. So this is the first time when its name is already there, and I'm holding up a wrench, and they're not telling me it's a wrench, they're telling me it's a tool, because I've asked them to classify it as a food or a tool. So the very first time I hold it up, they tell me it's a tool, and they were all able to do that. So then I switched to the pictures, and I took the same three pictures that I had trained them with as a tool, and I trained them, when I show you this picture, tell me if it's a food or a tool. And then I did the same thing with the foods, and that went really quickly because they'd already learned the full food tool categorization, so they just applied it to the three pictures that I trained them with. Then I showed them all these other pictures, and they're like, oh, it's a food or a tool. They immediately knew it. So then the key test was to just train them with three lexicograms. I hold up this lexigram, and you tell me, is it a food or a tool? No human could do that if they didn't know the lexigram. And most humans didn't know the lexigram. So if I gave a human that test and I showed them these lexicograms, they could not tell me if it's a food or a tool. But I picked three, and I showed Sherman and Austin, tell me if this is a food or a tool just when I show you the lexigram. And they immediately transferred that really quickly because they'd done it with the pictures and the foods. So you'd hold up a lexigram, and they would tell you whether the lexigram is a food or a tool. So after they were able to do that, I showed them all the lexicograms they had never been asked before. And they could immediately look at the lexigram and tell you if the lexigram was a food or a tool. So to do that, they had to refer to that in their mind and make a symbolic judgment about that. And then they began to do that kind of thing in statement situations all the time. But I'm going to pick up this tool. I'm going to pick up this food. I'm going to take this tool outdoors. I'm going to do this with this thing. So as soon as we got to that level, then I could set up a situation where I could put all the tools or foods in a room. And then I could say, tell me what you're going to do. They'd say, oh, I'm going to get the key. Or, oh, I'm going to get the apple. And I'd say, well, go get it. And then they'd go in that room and they'd get it. So there had to be a correspondence between what they said they were going to do and what they did. Because they had told me I had this reference of what. So the only way I could tell if they were right about their plan was whether they carried out their plan. Mm-hmm. So they had an intent. I had no intent. They stated their intent. I said, okay, I mean, I don't care what. You can get anything you want. Just tell me what you're going to get. That's all I'm asking you to do. They couldn't have ever understood that instruction if they weren't operating at the level. We have different intentions. We have different referential ways of looking at things, and we're coordinating them. When I got to the point with Lana of showing the lexigram, and you tell me whether that lexigram is a food or a tool. Lana did it with the foods. She did it with the pictures. She failed with the lexicograms. So when I showed her a lexigram, she couldn't tell me if it was a food or a tool. So I didn't know whether she had been unable to be referential or whether she was referential in a different way than Sherman and Austin were, because she didn't ever have a partner. Sherman and Austin always had a partner. They always had a dialogue